I'll start the recording just so everyone knows. Okay, so welcome everyone to our session today. As you're aware, this session I think is the first one we're running on as we address this theme of Global Accessibility Awareness Day. So fantastic to have you all along, and certainly Blackboard looking forward to running this series throughout the day, of which this is the first. And we're really excited as well to have as our main event for today Matt Brett from Deakin University, who's going to really talk to us from awareness to action, disability inclusion in higher education. And, having already spoken to Matt, personally looking forward to the three questions he's looking to address, and then particularly finishing off with a couple of case studies as well. It's not going to be a straight presentation. There's going to be a chance to comment. So hopefully a lot of you can jump in the chat. We even might throw in a few polls from time to time. So feel free to voice your opinion there if you're not keen to jump on the chat and do things that way. So you've probably heard enough of me, and I'll now hand over to Matt to address us on the topic awareness to action. Thanks, Matt.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you also to Blackboard for putting on this event. It's a great privilege and honour to be kicking it off Global Accessibility Awareness Day, and this is an issue that's very, very close to my heart. Also, just want to just acknowledge as a kind of starting point that when we're talking about kind of accessibility and technology and disability, what a kind of fantastic demonstration of how far things have come when we've got people from around the world dialing into a live kind of seminar that's being live captioned, fully accessible. It's really cool. Also, just want to say as well to the center captioner that's captioning at the moment. My family, a lot of the time, always pulls me up on kind of mumbling, and I think the combination of an Australian accent and my mumbling voice, I feel your pain. I'm speaking as clearly as I can for you, and we can make this as accessible as we can for everyone that's tuning in today. I thought I'd kick it off just by unpacking the title of this presentation a little bit. It is Global Accessibility Awareness Day, and I thought it really provoked me to think a little bit more clearly around what do we mean by awareness? Is that what is the kind of status of awareness when it comes to higher education and technology for students with disabilities? And should we be turning our attention more to actually doing things? If we're aware of a problem, what do we do in response, rather than just being aware that there's an issue there? So there's some of the things that I'm hoping to address in today's webinar. And again, just want to say thanks to Blackboard and Mark and others in the team for making this possible. I'm going to kick it off by putting forward this startling statistic, or this very kind of remarkable statistic when it comes to Australian higher education. And I'm going to put a focus on Australia, and I just want to recognise that there are some people that have joined or registered for this session who are from outside of Australia, and that requires me to perhaps go through some of the details that'll be familiar to members of this webinar, or participants in this webinar who are from Australia, but I'll just need to go over some of those kind of base details for international members of the audience. The number and proportion of students with disability in Australian higher ed has increased every year since data was first reported. That's quite a remarkable outcome, and if you have any kind of doubts about that proposition, I'm going to sort of go to the chart and the numbers. What we have here is a chart that demonstrates the enrolments, which is the kind of red line and the left-hand axis. So since '96, when we first started reporting any data on disability in higher education in Australia, numbers were about 10,000, and year on year it just keeps increasing. Some years the increase has been only slight, but it has increased every year, and the proportion also has. This is the green line and the right-hand axis. So this is an indisputable trend towards inclusion. Things are getting better and better and better. There's a lot to unpack in this statistic as well. If one thinks around social attitudes towards disability in '96 and social attitudes towards disability today, we're not necessarily measuring. I see some things coming through around audio not working very well. So can I just maybe get some thumbs up as to whether or not you can hear me, or whether or not we have a problem here with the audio? So some thumbs up coming through. A few people with some problems. Okay. So I'm not sure for those that can't get the audio. I'm sorry. I'm not sure. Perhaps some of the Blackboard tech support can provide some support with that. So the social attitudes towards disability in '96 are different to 2016. The sector is also very different as well. So we now have a much many more students participating at a postgraduate level in higher education, and as we would all be aware, disability is correlated with age. So if you've got older students engaging in higher ed, you're likely to get a little bit more disability in the mix as well. So it's all well and good to celebrate that things are getting better, that there is participation. But if one sort of picks at those statistics a little bit, there are reasons to but more questions arise. And if we think about disability and inclusion in the long term, this has got me to think about a number of questions. And the first of those is, do we understand the factors that are leading to inclusion? Will the trend towards inclusion continue? And how do we safeguard a more inclusive future? With those three questions, if you have any comments or any thoughts, please chat amongst yourselves. Please think about sort of comments or observations that you might make about those questions, and we'll have opportunities to delve into the expertise of participants in this room or this webinar before I move on to some what I would consider to be some real exemplars of inclusion in Australian higher education. Again, relevant to any international participants in this webinar, I think it's worthwhile highlighting that some of the lessons and some of the trends that are observed or can be seen in Australian higher education are probably evident also in your higher education system as well. And I'd be really keen to hear from people that are participating in this program to any thoughts or any observations you might make in relation to whether or not any of these propositions are that will be covered in this webinar will be pertinent or relevant to your system and your experience. So just to kind of set the scene a little bit around these three questions, what's driving inclusion, its future, and how it might be safeguarded. I've been involved with a number of publications in disability over the last few years. Each of those is relevant to those questions. So the first, when it comes to factors driving inclusion, myself and colleagues Andrew Harvey from La Trobe University and Catherine Bernheim from Monash University co-edited a book on student equity in Australian higher education, 25 years of a fair chance for all. And for those who are not aware, Fair Chance for All was a landmark policy report in Australia that was put out in the early 1990s, and it had a really big impact on disability in Australian higher education. Within that book, I prepared the disability-related chapter on the drivers of inclusion and some of the policy influences on that topic. In terms of the future of inclusion, myself and others from the National Centre for Student Equity in Higher Education led some national consultation around a long-term policy statement for equity in Australian higher education, which was released earlier this year, and we called that the best chance for all. So we've been thinking a little bit about the future of inclusion. Thirdly, when it comes to safeguarding inclusion, I did a fellowship through the National Centre for Student Equity in Higher Education titled Equity, Performance and Accountability. So I've been thinking a lot about how do we ensure that our policy and our governance and our practices really integrate equity as well as that. And altogether is just a way of saying that I've got been doing a lot of thinking in this space, and it's a really good opportunity today to share some of my thoughts and to hear from you also as to any thoughts you might have on this topic and on these issues. So a bit of a history lesson in some respects when it comes to higher education equity policy, to understand some of the drivers of inclusion. And if we take things back a little bit to 1984, the then Tertiary Education Commission was set the task of developing priority groups for equity in Australian higher education. And this is the first time that disability was mentioned as a priority group in Australian higher education. A few years later, in 1988, there was a green and white paper process that led to some very large reforms in Australian higher education. We had a binary system of higher education, which generated a national unit system, and that again affirmed the groups that were first articulated in the Tertiary Education Commission's work, and set some very more progressive policy objectives for equity in Australian higher education. Whilst there was a broad system-wide commitment to equity as a result of that white paper process, it was recognised that there needed to be a little bit more detail. We needed a little to the way in which we constructed our equity policy, and the government of the day commissioned some experts to develop a policy statement called A Fair Chance for All. And this is the topic of the book that myself, Andrew and Catherine edited. This document set equity targets, did other things like mandating equity plans for institutions, and what the target for disability was to, I think, double participation over a set period of time. It was recognised that it was very difficult to make progress or assess progress against that target because we didn't have a disability indicator. There's no way of measuring the participation of students with disabilities in Australian higher education at the time. So another piece of work was commissioned to develop equity performance indicators, and a temporary disability indicator was introduced as a result of that process. In the book A Fair Chance for All, or 25 Years of a Fair the person responsible for that project, the equity performance indicators, Lynn Martin, who's now a commissioner with the Australian Tertiary Education Regulator, kind of writes around the struggles of getting disability recognised within the equity policy framework. And at the time, many people were advocating for disability not to be included as an equity group, or not to be included in the indicator framework. And it was only narrowly passed after a vote of the guiding committee. And that highlights in some ways that equity or disability at that time was right at the margins. People thought it was important, but it hadn't fully been integrated in our way of thinking about higher education. And at that sort of point in time, it sort of made the jump from kind of periphery to not quite the mainstream, but an accepted part of Australian higher education. As a bit of a lesson for anyone involved in policy, the temporary indicator for disability in 1994 has remained unchanged to this day, and several researchers and several policy consultation processes have sought to improve or change or refine the indicator, but it hasn't changed at all. And I think it's a bit of a reminder that if we're going to do things in policy and around inclusion, that we should be really mindful that what might be considered temporary may well become permanent very quickly. So this chronology of equity policy really kind of highlights that disability has been there within higher education as a policy priority for 30 plus years, a long period of time. But higher education doesn't operate as an island in its own right. It operates in a broader social, economic, legal sort of context. And the slide on screen at the moment talks about the evolution of Australian disability legal frameworks. So if we go back to 1977, the Equal Opportunity Act in Victoria was enacted, and disability was not included. It wasn't an attribute that was protected under that legislation. It wasn't until 1982 that the rights that were extended to other groups were first extended to disability within that legislation. Another 10 years before the rights that were evident in some states, and some state-based legislation was extended to the Commonwealth level through the introduction of the Disabilities Discrimination Act. And these dates may seem quite different to an international audience whose legal frameworks may have been earlier or later, relevant to your own sort of context, but these are the dates for Australia. What we see is that the Disability Discrimination Act has evolved and refined, and it now includes various standards for various activities. So public transport standards were introduced in 2002, standards for education in 2004, access to premises in 2000. But what we don't have is any standards for internet access or technology accessibility of any form. We do have some guidance notes that have been put out by the Human Rights Commission, but they do not have the same legal standing as the standards for regional public transport, etc. Now, what this legal framework kind of shows is that the growth of students with disabilities in Australian higher education is underpinned not only through the actions of higher education, but through broader protections that have made the ability for people with disabilities to participate in education and in a whole range of life activities has been supported through a progressively refined and improved set of legal frameworks. Turning attention now to funding and the way in which funding for disability in Australian higher education is achieved. So in Australia, students that enrol in universities are eligible for what's called the Commonwealth Grant Scheme, and the government will provide funding to universities to support the cost of the student enrolments. In 2015, this equated to a bit over $350 million. Student tuition fees as well would add to that and push that up to probably close to 600 million. And then we've got students that are enrolling in the system that are outside of the grant scheme, and that's pushed maybe to $700 or $800 million. There's a lot of base funding for students with disabilities in the system. There is also a kind of recognition that students with disabilities sometimes need adjustments of some kind, and today this session is being captioned. The captioner is doing this not as a kind of voluntary exercise out of the goodness of their heart. This comes at a cost, covered in this case by Blackboard, but for a student that needs materials in Braille or things, their classes delivered with a sign language interpreter or any other support, there's an additional cost there that needs to be recognised. And in 2015, the government funding for those costs equated to $7 million, and a couple of propositions can be put forward in relation to those financing. The first, that base funding is overwhelmingly higher than any additional funding that might be present. And in addition to that, one can infer that the responsibility for providing these supports really sits with the institution. The government is overtly making a statement that it provides a partial level of support to universities to offset some of their costs, but it's not saying that it is the state that is fully responsible for the costs of additional support for students with disabilities. This is an institutional responsibility, which in many respects, when it comes to disability awareness and disability action, etc., starts to encourage one to think about where does the responsibility lie to actually undertake any actions to improve accessibility at all. In relation to the amount of Commonwealth funding for students with disabilities, what we see is that the amount of government funding per student, in light of a remarkable kind of increase in student enrolments has halved over the course of a decade. So the government's contribution is getting smaller and smaller, and the number of students participating in the system is getting higher and higher. So a significant development in some ways where more and more of the responsibility is being borne by institutions. One can ask whether or not institutions are upholding their end of the bargain. And what we see if we put all that together is that, particularly in the context of Global Accessibility Awareness Day, that disability has been a priority of the Commonwealth since 1984. It's protected by state legislation since 84. It's been protected by Commonwealth legislation since 92. It's been the focal point of specific standards since 2004. It represents increasing kind of proportion of students every year since data was collected, and also kind of represents a significant share of institutional revenue. So, one can ask, do we need more disability awareness? Have we got enough things in place to make sure that everyone's aware that this is something that we just need to do? One could take the view, we've got enough awareness now. We can all just get on with the work that we need to do and not worry so much about disability. But if one starts to look at some of the metrics around disability in Australian higher education, and particularly some of the metrics that were developed through the Equity General Performance Indicator Framework in the early 90s and the Fair Chance for All. So the access rate for students with disabilities is lower, the retention rate is lower, the satisfaction of students is lower, the full-time employment is lower, employment satisfaction with graduates with disabilities is lower. So across every metric, doesn't matter which one you choose, there is a disparity there that suggests there is room for improvement in the way in which we engage with disability in Australian higher education. So our awareness is not necessarily that we need to do something, because obviously the legal policy frameworks are in place. The emphasis, I think, needs to shift from awareness that there's legitimate needs to be taken into account to we need to do things to close the gap. We need to do things that are more effective to minimise some of the disparities that are evident in this performance information. The other question we can ask ourselves in this kind of space is whether or not this aggregate information around disabilities is useful. As we would perhaps all recognise, disability has many different facets from when it comes to web accessibility, often it's the vision impairment side of things that comes to the fro. Captioned videos brings in hearing, but there are many different facets of disability, and those statistics around disability in aggregate necessarily will mask the complexity that's associated with the disability concept. And when one does look at these kind of details in a more granular level, and I've got some statistics here from a report done by Sue Kilpatrick and colleagues. Darlene, I think, is in the audience today as well. So g'day, Darlene. Nice to see you here. This data kind of highlights that pretty much every subgroup of disabilities is below parity for all students or students without disabilities, and some of our fastest growing subgroups of disability have some of our lowest performance, and the other category is the lowest of all. When it comes to other, it's hard to say with any certainty what's included in that other category, because this is the result of students disclosing their disability in enrolment and ticking various options on their enrolment form. So other is thought to include issues of mental health and mental illness, but we can't say for sure because we just haven't done that that analysis to the best of my knowledge. But even if mental illness is not one-to-one in its relationship with the other category of disclosure, health or stress is a significant issue in Australian higher education. Each year, a student experience survey is undertaken for students in the system, and they are asked the question, have you seriously considered leaving the university? And for all students that are surveyed, around 1 in 5 or 19% said that they've considered leaving. That's significantly higher for students with disabilities at 20%. They're also asked, why have you why have you considered leaving the university? And for all students, the top reason that they cite is health or stress at 45%. For students with disabilities, it's the same reason as top health or stress, but that's at 68% of those students. So we've got an issue there in Australian higher education that we need to consider. And I think as we think about accessibility, these are this is I think a new frontier of various interaction and response. So we've chewed up a little bit of time in the webinar today to put forward some ideas as to why we've seen inclusion increase in the way it has and participation increase in the way that it has. And I thought this is just an opportunity to put it out there. You know, is this do we understand this enough? To ask you what you think is the driver of inclusion. Government policy? Is it kind of the commitment of institutions, or is it perhaps an indirect response to societal change? And this also is a way of being able to showcase just the capabilities of the platform and the technology that we're using today, the technology that makes higher education increasingly accessible for students with any range of attributes, including disability. So the result, and people are sort of saying that university or institutional commitment is probably the weakest driver of inclusion. Social change is important, but government policy is out there at the front of the pack as being the primary driver of inclusion. I think in the context of the financial information that I put forward before, I think this is kind of interesting. Some of the government policy, including law, is undoubtedly a driver here. But if one looks at the funding, the amount of money that they're tipping in to cover the cost of students with disabilities and their participation has been declining year on year. So this is maybe a sort of question for you and the audience, or something to reflect upon, that if you think it is government policy that is the key driver of inclusion, how is it to inform your advocacy? How's it going to inform the way in which you might engage with government policy to make sure that it is continuing to be a key driver of inclusion in Australian higher education?
So Matt, when we look at the results from the audience participation, we can see that 9 thought government policy was important, 5 thought social change, and 2 around institutional commitment. So interesting based on what you were saying.
Yeah, indeed. And this is a kind of, in some respects, a nice segue into what comes next in the second section of today's webinar, which is what is the future going to look like? Will the trend continue? Will government policy be the kind of key driver of what happens next, or do we see that social or institutional changes will be more? To consider this notion of inclusion, how it might be changing across time, I've got up on screen a quote from one of my favourite books on higher education, from Clark Kerr, formerly the president of the University of California, and the uses of the university. And whilst this quote is about universities and not necessarily disability or inclusion, I think if you substitute disability and inclusion for university in this sort of quote, it gets to the spirit of what I'm encouraging you to think about. So how may it all work out? We do not know. Which way will this turn? And if history move the university up or down, and what will be the roles of conscious choice and action? Pardon me. Now, in terms of moving the conversation along, rather than coming up with some predictions as to what might happen in higher education for students with disabilities and accessibility, which are likely to be proven wrong, because what do I know? I thought I would think about this in the historic context and from a very, very personal perspective. So my parents are both profoundly deaf. I'm a child of deaf adults. Sign language is my first language, and that explains why I mumble my words sometimes, or mess up the grammar of my emails and whatnot. And it's also why I'm really, really pleased to see that today's session is being captioned. This is something that I've long advocated before as a way of improving access to students with hearing impairment. So that's a bit of my backstory. And my father died about 5 years ago. There's a picture of him up on screen. He's a very kind of handsome young man there. Some of you who know me personally might be thinking, how the hell did I turn out the way that I did in my hideous face and characteristics? But nonetheless, this is my father. Around the time of his death, my mother brought out from the drawer some of the letters that my father wrote to my mother before they met, because they were pen pals before they met each other. And my father was in Australia, my mother was in England. And in reading those letters, I was really struck at just how much things had changed. My father was kind of writing of all the different jobs he was doing, all the interesting things he was doing. We had a time of full employment in Australia, and there was no kind of sign in those letters that there was a kind of struggle of discrimination or a struggle of marginalisation and exclusion. I wrote about my father and his life, and there's a sort of quote up on screen from a piece that I wrote. And from that time of full employment, through the course of his life and through the course of his working, a lot of the places where he worked ceased to exist. The technology has moved on. What we see today in terms of the platform that we're using to conduct this webinar would have been kind of science fiction to people of that era. Very, 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 very different. And the latter phase of his kind of working age, the work kind of dried up, and it was very, very difficult for him to find work. And eventually, he got put on a disability pension with a whole range of emotional sort of connotations with that around whether or not he was deprived of the dignity of work and all the social benefits of being in the labour market. And I've put this up, number one, just again to make this kind of really personal. And I'm pretty sure that many of you that are engaged in today's kind of webinar will have your own stories around disability, your own perhaps family or friends that have disability in one way or another. It's really worthwhile asking ourselves the question around whether or not things are generally getting better. Are we getting more inclusive? Are the forms of inclusion sort of changing in ways that are both positive and negative? And I know in my father's case, things did not go as well as they might have. But it's a really powerful motivator for me in my career in higher education to make it as accessible as we can. And to make sure that we are positioning our students and our graduates to succeed, no matter what their disability may be. So in response to Clark Kerr's kind of quote around which way things might be going, I've put this there just to sort of kind of temper any very optimistic views with a kind of sense of pragmatism and a sense of realism that it's not always easy. Sometimes it can be really, really, really hard. In terms of taking this kind of question of how things might be in future when it comes to disability and inclusion, again, just putting up an illustration from the Best Chance for All, the policy statement that myself and Nadine Zacharias from the National Centre for Student Equity in Higher Education prepared. And the kind of very pithy way in which we've described this, Australia's future depends on all its people, whoever and wherever they are, being able to successfully engage in beneficial and lifelong learning. You could maybe substitute Australia for New Zealand or America or Canada or wherever it may be. And I think that would be an apt description for some of the challenges that many countries around the world face. And that given the pace of technological change, given the uncertainty that we all face in our careers and our work, and that I think education is really the key to making sure that we are heading towards a successful future in one form or another. And when it comes to students with disabilities and people with disabilities, we need to make our education system as accessible as it can be to really guarantee the future. Because I think we all benefit. We all are beneficiaries of an education system in which everyone can thrive and succeed. That gets us to our next kind of little mini poll, and I've done my own little prognostication of where things might be heading and how I've been thinking about things. And I just want to ask the question of you: do we think that the future is going to be good? Do we think it's going to be bad? Do we think it's a dynamic struggle where it's 2 steps forward, 2 steps backwards? The results are in. In some respects, we've got a very, very optimistic audience here today, which is good to see. We've got currently 18, 19, 20 people saying that the future will be more inclusive. We've got 5 perhaps more pessimistic realists sort of saying it'll be 2 steps forward, 2 steps back, and we've got no one saying it's going to be less inclusive. So that's a very positive kind of affirmation that we're all thinking that the world is going to be better in future, and we will be part of making it better in future. I'm not sure if you want to sort of add anything to that at all, Mark, before we get on to the next section.
No, I'm enjoying the commentary and the stories, and certainly my life can relate to you. I mean, both my grandparents were deaf and dumb, and you look at, the education that they went through 50, 60 years ago as opposed to now, and even now you can see how it's becoming more inclusive and better, and you just think that had they been born now, the environment and the learning opportunities have changed so much even in that space of time. So it's great to see that we're heading down that more inclusive, which is fantastic.
Yeah, and again, I mean, just look at what we're doing at the moment. Sometimes I step back and am very much in awe of just how far things have moved. And in my own parents' life, as technology improved and developed, it used to be that getting a television with subtitles, they'd have to spend in the order of $1,000, which is a lot of money back then, to be able to get a TV with this special subtitle decoder built into it. And for 2 people that were working in kind of factories and not earning a lot of money, that was a really big deal. Whereas now, Netflix, Stan, whatever it may be, pretty much everything is subtitled, and we're making things much more accessible overall. I think things have definitely improved in terms of technology and in ways that are allow for much more full and active participation in life, generally speaking. Anyway, kind of moving on now. So we've taken a poll. There's an overwhelming majority of people involved in this webinar that are saying that the future is going to be better. So how do we safeguard it? How do we make sure that it is going to be better? And what I would say, again, sort of reflecting the initial kind of analysis of how disability is, or how inclusion has been facilitated over recent decades. Disability it's a policy objective, it's a legal requirement, it's an entrenched presence in our universities and colleges, it's a revenue stream in its own right, and we've got various ways of measuring performance. But it's an open question: what else is important? What else do we need to do to make sure that we safeguard inclusion in Australian education? Again, I'd welcome your comments and through the chat function to share your thoughts on what do you think is important. Now, for me, in my fellowship on equity, performance and accountability, starting kind of quote which came from a predecessor equity fellow, Nadine Zacharias. In her report, she had a quote from an interview with a director of equity at an Australian university, and the quote is up on screen. It says, "I think the real question is, what happens to people who fail their target? Nothing." And that was a really useful way of being able to ground some of my research into accountability, because if anyone sort of reflects on some of the things that happen in their institutions, if you're employed in a university one way or another, often if the research targets aren't met, or if student loads targets aren't met, etc., sometimes heads roll. But does the same thing happen with disability inclusion? If we don't make a website accessible, what consequences? And I think that was something that got me thinking a lot about these issues of accountability for disability and for equity in Australian education. And there's a phrase that is often used when it comes to driving change through big organisations, and it's the tone from the top. It's what happens at the top of the university that really sets the agenda for a university and makes things happen. So what I did is I looked at those top level statements. I looked at strategic plans of Australian universities and the ways in which disability is referenced within those plans. And for the 40 universities that I looked at in 2007, only 10 had a reference to doing something about disability. If I were to have applied a more stringent criteria to say a specific target about improving participation outcomes for students with disabilities, I think that 10 would have probably dropped to maybe 2 or 3 at best. So Australian universities have not necessarily been putting this up front as a high level strategic priority. And if we think back to the poll result that we had earlier around the driver of change and whether it is university or government or society, there's very few people that thought it was universities that were driving the show, and that's kind of that's manifest in this statistic around strategic plan disability references. As public institutions, universities in Australia are also required to provide annual reports to parliaments around their performance. And again, 13 of those annual reports had some information about disability participation within them. And if I was to be, again, much more stringent about whether or not a university had a specific target or a specific objective about disability and tracking performance, that number would drop to 0. We're not making it a strategic priority in Australian higher education in ways that I think we could or should, given the performance data that I showed before around the disparities of success, retention, graduate employment, etc. Through doing that research in performance and accountability, and I'd encourage people to click through the link in due course and have a read of the research report. I commend it to you, but I sort of identified a number of accountability challenges and 4 strategic responses to those challenges. And the first of those was to refine our equity goals. The second, to improve information management so that we're capturing data that aligns with those goals. The third is to embed equity goals across the higher education system, and then to kind of continuously evaluate the outcomes. And I think if you see those 4 responses in the context of the number of universities that have disability as a strategic priority, we've certainly got room to improve those equity goals. We should certainly then be thinking about realigning and adjusting our information management consistent with that, and then finding ways of embedding it within the system. And I'm about to go through some exemplars in a second that will highlight that there is good work going on. We should celebrate that, particularly on given today is Global Accessibility Awareness Day, but there's still much more to do. That gets us to our final kind of poll in today's session, and that's just to ask you, what is the best way of safeguarding disability inclusion? Do you think that it's about really supporting students in their individual agency to use the legal protections they have to uphold their rights? Do you think it's about really supporting our disability advocates to dismantle the barriers that might be evident in the system? Do you think it's about institution policy and governance, or is it about the higher level government policy and funding? Obviously, all these kind of things should be happening in parallel, but I'm just kind of asking you, which of these things do you think is the most important to safeguarding inclusion for a more inclusive future for students with disabilities? So right now, this is a bit more mixed. So again, policy and funding being one of the more preferred responses. The second most significant is kind of recognising the role of disability advocates. There's less emphasis on policy and governance, and less emphasis again on individuals upholding their rights and responsibilities. I would, again, as I said, I think all these things need to happen in parallel. It's about getting the balance right between all of these. I would say in a context where the locus of responsibility from funding is shifting with institutions, my proposition is that we certainly need our institutions to be paying much closer attention to disability participation than they are currently, all of which the government can play a very key role in incentivising that kind of outcome. So thank you for your responses. Thank you all for your participation and engaging with this webinar in the way that you have so far. I might just kind of pause there, and I'm not sure, Mark, if you've been able to pick up on any questions that have come through the comments that are worth just responding to before I go into the exemplars.
Yeah, certainly Penny's just popped one up and has basically said there in the chat, is it evident how institutional responses for accessibility have contributed to the whole of the university population in success and dollar terms?
I think it's not very clear. This is maybe a roundabout way of sort of engaging with your kind of question. So thank you for that, Penny. But I think given very few universities have put forward very specific expectations around their equity performance, it's then very hard to draw any lines of causality between their success and their financial performance based on their equity performance. One thing that I can say in relation to that is that in some cases, universities are almost entirely dependent on equity groups of various forms to be a university. And in some cases, universities have been set up in specific communities that experience some kind of disadvantage, whether it be a regional community or a disadvantaged kind of outer suburban area of one of our cities, and they enrol almost all of their students from students from equity groups. So in those kind of instances, those institutions are all about equity, and it is interesting to me and perplexing to me as to how those commitments are not explicitly kind of represented in their strategic planning and in their own measures of success. It's like in some respects the broader policy objectives of the system are sort of driving those institutions to ignore some of the things that are really critical to their own performance and their own success. But I'm very, very happy to take up that conversation offline. Go, mate.
Yeah, so I was going to say, just following on, just one more question to then still give you time to, focus on some of the exemplars. But Christopher asked earlier in relation to what's happening at Deakin, are faculties there finding this as an opportunity to adopt open education type resources or OER textbooks or those types of materials as a way of addressing this problem?
Yeah, and I think in some ways what I might do is just kind of flick through to my first exemplar, because this really gets to the heart of that sort of question around how do we really progress inclusive curriculum design and open education resources. And the first exemplar I've got is by coincidence from Deakin University, and whilst I'm from Deakin University, I can say that I had nothing to do with this project, nothing to do with it being selected as an exemplar, but I'm very proud to put it up as an exemplar. So in Australia, we have the Higher Education Participation and Partnerships Program, which is primarily focused on the participation of students with from low socioeconomic status backgrounds, but some of the money does flow through to students with disabilities. And they went through a process of evaluating all the good programs that were going on around the sector and put a spotlight on those that were doing really well. So in this 2017 publication from the National Centre for Student Equity in Higher Education, Deakin's inclusive curriculum and capacity building project was spotlighted. I wasn't with Deakin at the time, but now that I am at Deakin and seeing some of the work that they're doing, I'm just really impressed with what I see. And what I see is not just good frameworks such as the inclusive education principles that are up on screen, but I see the way in which the university community as a whole is adopting these principles in its curriculum design and in its implementation of curriculum and course delivery. Deakin University is a university with a lot of online delivery, a lot of online learning. So these principles are embedded in what we do. All our videos are captioned. All our materials have alt tags and the like. So it's everyone's all in, which is kind of fantastic to see. And And this is the kind of thing that we need to be doing more broadly. And I would hazard a guess that the staff from that inclusive curriculum capacity building sort of project would be more than happy to sort of speak to anyone that's interested in this space from other universities. We're there to share our sort of knowledge and our expertise in this space, and I think we've been doing some really good work. The second exemplar I've got up is from Monash University. So I was a evaluator for this particular project. So just again, sort of disclosing my sort of interest in this particular project. But when one thinks about the nature of curriculum and the nature of knowledge and the kinds of information that's included in various forms of study, particularly in STEM, there's a lot of graphics. I've put up charts on screen today. Sometimes there's kind of representations of molecules, et cetera, et cetera. So this project was really trying to put a spotlight on how we might be able to make some of that graphical information more accessible. And the screen grab on screen at the moment shows how they've used 3D printing to develop campus maps and city maps and geographic maps, et cetera. So the technology now is not just around making the web accessible, but it's how do we find really efficient and effective ways of translating that graphical information into the most accessible form possible. Really good work, and I commend that to you. Another part of the work is called Gravitas, so graphics viewer using vibration interface, touch and speech. So some of the technology they were developing with this is a kind of a representation of the brain. So if you were to click on part of that, you would get a vibration to sort of show that there's different things going on. So again, this is an international exemplar in some ways of how graphical information can be made as accessible as it can be to students with vision impairment. Really, really high quality work. The next exemplar of inclusion, I would say, comes from the University of Melbourne, and particularly in relation to the mental health issues that I was talking about before. So they ran a project called Enhancing Student Wellbeing and developed resources for university educators on how you can embed within the curriculum ways of thinking, ways of teaching, ways of supporting students that really mitigate the propensity for people to develop levels of mental ill health and distress. A fantastic resource, a fantastic project, some really, really good resources that were developed from the sector to focus on how we can really enhance student wellbeing within our curriculum. The final exemplar I'll put forward is really the Australian Disability Clearinghouse on Education and Training at the University of Tasmania. So a fantastic resource that's been hosted by the University of Tasmania for I think around 15 years, maybe even longer. And it just goes from strength to strength. The quality of resources they have there, it's fantastic. They're running webinars like this on a regular basis on special topics. I commend everyone to tap into this to get some of the nuanced details around how we can do things from universal to student support, etc. It's a fantastic resource, and kind of hats off to Jane and Darlene, who I think are part of the presentation or part of the webinar kind of audience today. So I just want to say hats off to you. I really, really like your work. Really, really like what you're doing. This gets me to the final slide. It's just another opportunity for you to make some comments or some questions in the chat, but also just to remind you that this is the first of several events that are being kind of hosted by Blackboard for Global Accessibility Awareness Day. The first, I think, is from Puerto Rico. I don't speak Spanish. I'm not sure if anyone else can read that out for me. We have events also in America with Atlantic Cape Community College and the University of Toledo. And finally, Blackboard themselves with tips and tricks for inexpensive accessibility testing. All those events are available from that web link, which have just gone out on the chat as well. So yeah, over to you. We've got a few minutes left for any final comments or questions, and I just want to say thank you so much, Blackboard, for the opportunity to talk about my own personal story, my own contributions to disability and inclusion in higher education, and thank you everyone for doing the work that you do and your passion and your commitment to accessibility.
Thanks heaps for that, Matt. Really exciting to hear your passion around this topic, and certainly I've learnt a lot, and the exemplars that you finished up with are certainly great examples of some of the things that we can do. Very happy to open up for any questions before we finish off.
I think we have a couple of questions coming through on chat about recording of the session. I think it has all been recorded and will be made available as far as I know. I'm not sure if we can share the link as to where we might be able to find that, Mark.
Absolutely. I'm sure the marketing will jump on and tell us how and where. But I think too the fact that you've also included the URLs to some of those exemplars is also fantastic, and not only will be the recording shared, but the PowerPoint slides as well. So that should come out in a follow-up email, I suspect. Yeah,
I'm also getting lots of thumbs up and lots of positive feedback on the chat as well. So thank you. It's really pleasing to get that feedback, and I'm really glad that I've been able to give you an hour of your day that's been enjoyable and rewarding. So thank you all so much.
Thanks heaps. We might close it off there. And again, appreciate the work that you've done, Matt. Also, a big shout out to the captioners in the background, who I've been amazed at how well they've kept up with everything as we've gone. A fantastic job there as well. And obviously, thank you all for participating and listening, and look forward to working with you all moving forward. Thanks again.